Assassin's Creed has never been a series that's encouraged ultra-realism. I mean, the Hidden Blade basically works like magic, and the Apple of Eden is literal magic, yet Assassin's Creed in its combat and world always felt immersed and grounded, and had that realism feel. Swords felt heavy and weren't swung around like nunchucks, and enemies didn't have supernatural powers, they were just good old humans. But ever since, really, Assassin's Creed Origins, the realism in the world of Assassin's Creed has changed big time, especially in Odyssey, and still a significant amount in Valhalla. People may think I just have a problem with games that have fantasy elements, which is not true at all, which is evident considering one of my favorite games of all time is The Witcher 3. But what does bother me is when a series like Assassin's Creed establishes its world and lore based on real historical events and gives its game a grounded, realistic feel, especially with the combat. And once the series made the switch to an RPG, a lot of that realism was thrown out the window to the point now in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, where we are getting godlike druids, magic animals, and superpowered chickens to duel. We went from fighting the Knights Templar in the Crusades to fighting chickens in Viking raids. Sounds about right. If you watched one of my videos on Valhalla before, and really this goes for Odyssey and Origins too, one of my biggest gripes with the RPG games is what they did to the combat. In Valhalla, the combat just looks and feels so unrealistic. You hit a guy 30 times in the face and he doesn't die. You're swinging what should be an extremely top-heavy weapon with complete ease like it's a lightsaber. I mean, I'm literally using a glowing Excalibur that shoots flashbangs when I swing. What has happened to this series? Back in the day, we used normal swords, no glowing, colorful magic voodoo that looks like it belongs in a fantasy RPG rather than an Assassin's Creed game. Not to mention the special abilities. I feel like this issue is more prevalent in Odyssey, like the invisibility, teleportation, no fall damage, but Valhalla still has a lot of ridiculously unrealistic abilities, like the magic sword charge up, the ability to shoot arrows through walls, and even the slow motion camera when you dodge. There's just a lot of little things like that as well that kind of just kill the realism of what the series stood for. Not to mention, it takes at least 5 hits to kill a basic enemy, and even more for the captains and all of the higher enemies. While in the old games, it was extremely quick and clean, only a hit or two to kill. You could also instant kill on a counter, and that's actually realistic. The AI didn't have ridiculous ragdoll physics and motion capture, and animations made the combat look a lot more realistic and weighted. Again, even in games like Ghost of Tsushima, the combat is still very fun and fast-paced while still looking grounded and realistic. And I'm not sure why Assassin's Creed would try to take the Witcher God of War route with their combat, especially when this series is based on history and realism, not fantasy. Something like Ghost of Tsushima style combat would have been much more appropriate for the RPG Assassin's Creed games. And don't even get me started on the enemy types, especially in the new DLC, The Wrath of the Druids for Assassin's Creed Valhalla. You're fighting a magic order who summon beasts and animals to fight you. There's people being possessed and witches and potions and sky beams, all that crazy stuff that you would expect from a fantasy fiction. It's so far off from what Assassin's Creed is and should be that it's saddening. The most unrealistic part about the old AC games were the Izu and Pieces of Eden, which hardly, if ever, interfered with the rest of the realism in the game. And I think the Apple of Eden was introduced in a way that was actually believable, even though it's not realistic. They were able to make it believable for this world that it was in, if that makes sense what I'm trying to say. Now, instead of fighting Templar leadership and Grand Masters, we are fighting this. Even the outfits and mounts you unlock in the game look completely ridiculous and unrealistic, and it just completely goes against everything Assassin's Creed used to stand for. The realism is just one of many ways how Assassin's Creed has changed since Origins, and the realism is part of the series' identity, but we all know Ubisoft seems to not care, because Assassin's Creed is starting to look more like a fantasy series rather than a historical realism-based series. It shows in the outfits, enemies, lore, and combat. And as a big fan of the series, it's really aggravating to see that. Ghost of Tsushima feels more like Assassin's Creed these days than Assassin's Creed does itself, and I'm hoping Ubisoft takes a long look at what they've done to this once realism-inspired series. But let me know your thoughts on how the realism has changed in the Assassin's Creed series, and if you feel AC Valhalla has too many fantasy elements to it. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more Assassin's Creed and Valhalla related videos, I've already made a lot, so I'd appreciate it if you subscribed if you want to see more. And other than that, thanks for watching, and stay stealthy, Assassins.